I wish that I knew that getting clients and auditioning is the real work. Recording is just the icing on the cake. I'll say that again. I wish that I knew that getting clients and auditioning is the real work. Recording is just the icing on the cake. How do I mean? Voiceover is not just an art, it's a business. The business has to be sustained, and then you need to do a lot of business-related activities to ensure that you're able to get the gigs.
Hi, and welcome to the Everything Voiceovers podcast. I am Tcode, an African voiceover talent from Nigeria, and this is my podcast, where I take on voiceover topics from an African perspective. In this episode, I continue on the topic Things I Wish I Knew Before Starting a VO Career. I shared my personal experiences to help up-and-coming talents avoid common mistakes beginners make. Sit back and enjoy this episode.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Everything Voiceovers podcast. It's Tcode here again, your host, and today we're going into the part 2 of what we discussed last week, which is things I wish I knew before I started my voiceover career. And last week I shared about 8 things that I wish I knew before I started my voiceover career, and now I'm sharing the other 8, or maybe more than that, things that I wish that I knew before I started my voiceover career. Just a quick refresher, last week I talked about how I wish that I knew that voiceover is more than just commercials, right? I grew up thinking that voiceover was just, hey, buy, sell, commercial stuff like that. But then I realized that there was the voice acting parts, which had a lot of things like animation, audio dramas and stuff. So yeah, that was one. I also talked about the fact that I wish I knew that I didn't need a certain type of accent to do animation voiceovers, right? Yeah. Because as Africans, a lot of us, we want to do animations like we grew up watching them in the cartoons that we saw as kids, right? And most of those cartoons were done by white people. I'm talking about Americans, Britons, and other races. So I don't necessarily have to have their type of accent to do an animation in my own locale that mirrors my society, right? So that is another thing that I wish I had known earlier. But yeah, I caught up with it soon enough. Another thing that I listed is that I wish that I knew how much professional voice actors made in my country and even globally. That would have helped me tailor my mind as to how business-oriented this craft is and how I could properly interface with my clients or prospective clients and not make myself look ridiculously cheap. So well, now I know. Another thing that I talked about was how I wish that I knew there was a voiceover association in Nigeria with a rate card. Now, this is very much tied up with the last point that I just mentioned, because knowing that there is a standard in your country, how much has been stipulated as the standard, it really helps you to kind of position yourself properly when you talk about money, when you look at voiceover from a business context. So I wish that I had known this. I wish I had known that an association existed. People had been and are still trying to protect the interest of voice actors, and knowing what they've done, knowing their strives, knowing the policies and standards they've put in place would have really helped me to position myself. Another thing that I wish that I had known before starting my voiceover career is that I wish that I knew that being a voice actor does not equate to being a script writer. Absolutely. Yes. The truth is that the voiceover business is tied around so many other things, right? And we find out that voice actors in this age are trying to do everything, but that doesn't mean that you're an expert in all of these fields. Script writing legitimately is, okay, let's say copywriting or even script writing is legitimately a skill on its own that you can go and learn. So the fact that you can do commercials, the fact that you've read it over and over and you know how it sounds, does not necessarily mean that you have all it takes to be a script writer, but you can develop that skill. And how that even helps you balance your business is for you to know that you don't owe your client that service. If your client wants you to write a script for him or her, they need to pay for it. Yeah, they should actually pay for it. So that is one of the things that I wish I had known earlier. Instead, I was busy writing scripts for everybody that needed me to do a voiceover that and the funny thing is that some clients that we work with, they don't know. It's funny, right? But that's how it is over here. A couple of clients don't know that they need to provide you with a properly written script by a copywriter, especially small business that are trying to grow. They just feel like it's a voiceover artist's job to craft the script, put in all of the technical jargons and, sell the script, sell the story, sell the business. So, yeah, you heard it. And if you want more gist on that, go to episode 1 or go to part 1 of this topic. All right, another thing that I wish that I knew before starting my voiceover career, that I mentioned last week, is that I wish that I knew that being a voiceover artist, or rather being an elocutionist, is not equal to being a voiceover artist. Yes, the fact that you understand diction, the fact that you understand pronunciations, the fact that you speak well, it doesn't mean you're a voiceover artist, because voiceover artistry is a skill. And especially if you're going into voice acting, you need to understand acting itself. You need to know how to project and convey emotions and, all of the things that acting entails, right? And the last two I mentioned was, 1, attending a voiceover training does not make me a voiceover professional. I wish I'd known this earlier, right? It's just that assumption that if I go to school and I learn a course and I get a certificate, I've been certified as a professional in that in that craft. I think that's an erroneous way of looking at it, because for a craft like the voiceover business, the fact that you've learned, the fact that you've gone to a voiceover training academy or a school doesn't mean that you're a professional after getting that certificate. You attended. Being a professional entails you haven't done the job over and over and over and over and over again. You've built a lot of experiences. You know how to deal with bad situations. You've had your success stories and even your failures, right? So all of these things put together, they mirror what a professional should look like. So that's it. And then the last one I talked about last week is that I wish that I knew that voiceover is a business and not just an art. Yeah, it's a business. So it needs to be treated as such. It needs to be treated in terms of profit making, income, budget, investing, and stuff like that. So it's very obvious that for your business to thrive, for you to make a living out of voiceovers, you need to become a business person as well. So those are like the 8 things that I mentioned and that I explained last week. And this week, I'm going to be talking more. I'm going to be explaining more things that I wish that I'd known as a voiceover artist. By the way, before I get into it, I really saw the reactions. The listens, the listeners. You all are amazing. More people listened. The listenership is growing every week, and I'm so happy about that. You can keep sharing the podcast with your friends, with people everywhere. I'm sure that the content of this podcast will be very helpful, especially for beginners. Yeah, so let's get into the other things that I wish that I'd known before I started my voiceover career. Today, number 1 on the list is that I wish that I had known that being a voiceover artist does not make me an audio producer or a sound designer. Yeah, that's true. And you know why this is a bit clumsy? Because a lot of times, like I said earlier, voiceover is attached or tied to different skills. So voiceover itself is using your voice to interpret a script, to pass a message in the right manner. But then it doesn't stop there. There are other things like script writing that I mentioned earlier, and there are other things like sound design and audio production and stuff like that. The point I'm making is that while you're trying to hone your skill as a voiceover artist, knowing how best to use your voice, sound designing and production are equally relevant skills. So if you're going to become an expert, if you're going to become a professional at those, you need to give them equal attention. You need to probably train, which is most advisable. You need to devote yourself to that craft. and not assume that because you can use your voice and you understand how to cut and join and paste on any of the DAWs, DAW, digital audio workstation like Adobe Audition, Audacity, and the likes, that doesn't mean that you are a professional producer or sound designer, right? So, because there are people who study, they train, and they do this every day, and you equating yourself to them by saying you're a professional kind of like is disrespectful to what they have learned. It's just like an audio engineer saying he's a voiceover artist. Of course, you know that he needs to learn. He needs to prove himself worthy. Now, it doesn't mean that if you can do these things, you should stop because you aren't seen as a professional. No, it only means that you can always get better. It only means that you have an extra skill that supports what you do, and you're willing to, be better at it. Or you can just do what is necessary, what is needed for you. So as a voiceover artist, for instance, you're doing audiobooks or even commercials, you need the basic knowledge of knowing how to cut out errors, reduce breath sounds, take care of plosives, and stuff like that. So it's important for you to understand, have the basic editing skills, but it doesn't mean that you are a sound designer or an audio producer. You just have the basic knowledge of these things. For you to become professional in these fields, you need to take it more seriously than just the basics. And I hope you understand what I'm saying. So it's important because if you don't see it this way, you're going to advertise yourself as someone who does these things. And then if magically somebody comes to you and says, I want you to produce this, I want you to produce an audiobook with all of the sound effects or this audio drama, you might be lost, or you might not be able to deliver as expected. And that really can hurt your profile, So present yourself in the skills that you're most competent in, and you don't have to wear all the hats. I'm not saying you shouldn't develop yourself in other areas, but what you're proficient at, what you're competent at doing, is best to put those things forward while you train and you grow at the other things. Do you get me? So this is one of the things that I wish I had known. And the reason why this is even appearing in my own list is because having a radio background kind of exposed me to production early enough. But I later understood that there's a difference because, with the radio background, I needed to record, I needed to produce. I also worked a bit in the news department. So, you go out, you record, you want to cut, you want to paste, you want to ensure that this is properly packaged, right? So all of those things, they just make me understand the basics of audio editing, but I wasn't really a professional in the full sense of it, because when you have a professional working, the difference is obvious. You can see how the mastery in how he uses the effects and everything, and even the speed of work is quite different. So this is just respecting their craft and letting you see that if you want to become a professional in those parts, in those crafts, you need to work, you need to advance. All right. Having said that, the next thing I want to talk about is that I wish that I knew that I didn't always have to rush the scripts, especially for commercials. Now, I know this may sound very weird, but the reason why this is featuring in this episode is that I realized that it's not just me. I have had a few other people who went through the same phase, who thought that, you needed to be fast. Now, there are two types of people that have this challenge. One, we have the people who they see a commercial script and they just want to rush through it, right? And there are others that they're not necessarily rushing through it, but when it comes to the point of editing, they start to cut away, they start to cut off all of the gaps, all of the spaces, right? The pause that they find in the recording. And again, like I said, for people who are doing this already, for people who are experts in this, it's not a big deal. In fact, you're probably surprised that this is making it into the list. But the truth is that for some of us, if I talk about how I started voiceovers, it's quite funny because I grew up listening to a lot of voiceovers that were very fast. And I think one of the reasons, of course, is because they're trying to shrink a lot of words into 60 seconds or 30 seconds, and you have them running, like giving it, pacing a lot, like rushing. It was later on that I realized that in the editing softwares, you can actually speed up the pace of the original recording. So you don't have to necessarily be as fast as you hear them in those commercials. But the truth is, originality is best. It's better when you're actually that originally, pacey. It makes the work more original, more real, right? So that is one thing. It doesn't have to always be a speed rushed read. You can take your time. You can interpret the script, let it flow. So that's one. And for the other people who like to cut out all of the pauses, it doesn't still make it as far. I mean, it just makes it very unnatural. Sometimes the breath, even like hearing the breath makes the recording sound natural. And I know this is a debate. This is very arguable. Some people would rather not even have the breath at all. But for me, I think I've done this for a while now, and I understand that sometimes it's okay to have the breath. Sometimes it's not okay to have the breath. Sometimes it's okay to reduce the breath and not have it taken off entirely. So it depends on the type of script or the genre of voiceover that you're doing and all of that. The point is that you don't always have to rush through your recordings. You can take your time. You can breathe. You can, do it as natural as possible. Let it flow. If you need to rush, you can. If you need to pace in the script, you can actually. But it has to be done in a manner that is befitting, in a manner that is very original, and not like you're just rushing and speeding through. People are listening. People are trying to make sense of what you're saying, all right? And it's going to also affect you because you're running out of breath and you're trying to catch up, and then, we're missing that real feel, that real human feel of the voiceover. Anyway, so this is one of the points that I thought I should include. Another point is that I wish that I knew that content creation and social media management are highly relevant skills for my business success. So maybe because businesses now thrive on social media. Maybe not all businesses, but at least from the most that I know, a lot of businesses need social media to survive. For big businesses, they have a department, they have a team of people that work to ensure that the businesses, their social media presence, their presence on the internet is very strong, and they're able to make sales off that publicity. But for one-man businesses or individual freelancers like myself, it's important to understand that you need to have that skill. Okay, if it's not going to be a need, then you must be willing to outsource that responsibility to someone who is skilled at it. The point is that in the age of today, you almost cannot thrive in this business if you don't have a level of social media presence. Now, it is also very debatable because some people will say, oh, I know some people who don't really invest so much on social media, but they're getting the gigs. Well, the truth is that it's been able to work for them, and you don't necessarily have to compare yourselves to them because you don't know the kind of work they've put in behind the scene, behind social media. You don't know the kind of marketing strategies that they've employed. But regardless of whatever marketing strategies that they employed and is working for them, you need to understand that times are really changing fast. There's this evolution. Everybody is just, putting their attention to social media. Shout out to Mark Zuckerberg. There is now Threads, the latest social media platform, and in a few days, it's cascaded. Threads was able to record over 10 million users in a few hours. That's crazy. It just shows how much people are willing to devote their time to social media. And if you're not on those platforms, you might not get the visibility that you want that will help your business grow. Because take it or leave it, if you're not there, some other voiceover talent, they're on those platforms and they'll get the visibility. So it's a matter of you need to do this to to up your chances of getting seen and your work's getting heard and you booking the gigs. So yeah, I wish I'd had someone to tell me this. So I just prepare my mind that, okay, if you're going to be going into this, you need to take your social media presence more seriously. Am I there yet? I'm not at the peak of that, but it's something that I work on. And yeah, and I hope that you're able to work on that as well. So if you're going to be a voiceover artist, be ready to put yourself out there. You're almost going to be a content creator, right? And a social media manager. So that's something you should put in mind. Another thing I listed here is that I wish that I knew that I needed much more than my voice and a phone to succeed. Yes. Now, if you look at this from the context of someone who has never started voiceover, who has never done voiceovers, or, is just trying to learn about voiceovers, it makes a lot of sense. If you've been doing this for a while, of course, you'll be like, oh, come on. You should know that you need more than your phone and your voice to succeed. Of course, yes. But there are a lot of people who are just starting and they think that the voice and the phone is what they need. Well, I've said it over and over, and I'm going to say it again. You cannot bank on using your phone to record. It's absolutely unprofessional. You need to record your voice in a microphone, preferably a condenser microphone. A dynamic microphone is not bad depending on the condition of your recording, but that's a story for another day. So the point is that recording and being successful in voiceovers takes beyond your phone and your voice. This year I've invested a lot. In fact, last year as well, I invested a lot in my home studio. It's funny that something as okay, let me put it this way. It's funny that something as basic as a chair in your studio, you need to pay attention to the kind of chair that you're buying. So for me, of course, I have a chair that I can spin in or roll in, and it's very comfortable, right? I paid a lot to get that chair. The point I'm making is that you need to think bigger than, oh, it's just your voice. What are the other things that you need? So, for instance, I talked about being a content creator, right? So, because of that, I have a ring light in my studio. Interesting, right? There are other things that you need. There are other things that will make your work or your business successful as a voiceover artist. It's not just being a voiceover artist. It's not just having a good voice. So, for instance, to help, my business structure, I have my rate cards, I have my invoice, I have my business registered, I have my company account, I have my tax identity number. These are things that would help your business, stand and be successful beyond just you have a good voice, right? And the truth is that you don't have to get all of those things at once. But when you're starting your career and you're seeing that these are the things that you need, your mind is prepared and you know what to acquire with time and with each stage of your growth in your voiceover career. All right, so I thought this is just worth adding to the list. Now, another thing that I wish that I knew before starting my voiceover career, which is obvious already based on the other things that I've talked about, that I've mentioned, is that I wish I knew that at least about 70% of your voiceover business is a do-it-yourself thing. Like 70% of the things that you're going to be doing in your voiceover business is kind of like do-it-yourself, DIY. It doesn't have to stay that way. It doesn't have to remain that way. But the truth, again, is that voiceover artists are left to figure out a lot of things on their own, especially if you're going to be doing it as, if you're going to be working from home, or if you're going to be doing it full time. You need to be creative. You need to do the research yourself, learn yourself, because at the early stage of your business, you're not going to be making so much that you can throw around and have somebody manage this for you, manage that for you. You get to a point where, of course, you can hire a social media manager or a virtual assistant and what have you. But in the early stages, it's all you trying to figure it out, starting from figuring out the kind of microphone that you want to use, to try and figure out the part of your house that you'll make your home studio, to trying to figure out how to contain the studio enough that it's not giving echoes, to trying to figure out, how to ensure that, you record at the right time when there are not much noise in the atmosphere, to trying to figure out which pay-to-play platform you want to register on, to figuring out how to get paid internationally, to figuring out how to put your rate cards together. Like, most of the steps that you're taking, you have to learn to do it yourself. And that's why, if you're going to be successful as a voiceover artist, you need to be so you need to care about knowledge. You need to learn as much as possible. If it means learning on YouTube, which it sure do means, you need to learn a lot on YouTube. If it means listening to podcasts, and you don't have to listen to just one podcast. I listen to various podcasts to learn from different people. I listen to some podcasts that are just devoted to sound engineers. I listen to podcasts that are devoted to coaches, because I'm also a coach. I listen to voiceover podcasts that are related to, just voiceovers, right? So there are different types of podcasts, just to ensure that you have a wholesome knowledge about your craft and your industry. You need to attend webinars and all of that, because those are the ways you understand, what are the things that while you're trying to do yourself, you didn't do well and you can work on. Because the downside about doing it yourself is that sometimes you don't do it the right way, and you probably don't have anybody to tell you that this isn't how it ought to be done. And you may just live with that error for a long time, and it's affecting your productivity, but you are not just able to figure it out early enough. So you need to seek knowledge. You need to learn as much as possible. That way, the do-it-yourself becomes slightly easier and better, actually. So yes, a lot of the things you're going to be doing in the voiceover industry is a do-it-yourself thing. Well, another thing on my list is that I wish that I knew before starting my voiceover career that most of my questions have been answered in a podcast. Yes, this sounds funny, right? But it's the truth. Many of the questions that you have that are related to voiceovers, there is a podcast, there's an episode out there that those questions have been answered. And the turning point for me was when I started listening to podcasts, plus when I started listening to other voiceover artists on platforms like Clubhouse, right? That really helped my journey. But you see, podcasts, the beautiful thing about podcasts is that the conversations are well tailored, recorded, optimized for your listening, unlike Clubhouse. So regardless, what I'm trying to say is that there are, again, lots of podcasts out there that would answer your voiceover related questions. For Africans, well, you see, so what we do is we try to learn as much as we can from, every channel. And in the voiceover space in Africa that I know of, we're about just 4 voiceover podcasts or voiceover related podcasts. 3 from South Africa and 1 from Nigeria. It's funny, right? So yeah. Why did I say that? Is that some of the podcasts you listen to out there, a lot of things are very relatable, but there are some areas that you cannot necessarily, import into your local system. Maybe, for instance, you're talking about taxis, or you're talking about even rates. Some parts can be imported. Some parts are not so realistic in the African terrain or in the African context. There are just so many things that are very, very relative. And that's why it's important to listen to the foreign podcasts as well as you're listening to the indigenous podcasts. That's one of the reasons why I created this podcast, just to give the African perspective to voiceovers, right? So if you're an African, you can relate to some of the things that I'm saying. Many of us podcasters, we invest our time to answering many of your questions. We invest our time to sharing our experiences. We invest our time in interviewing people who have a lot of stories and experiences to share, and that way we answer a lot of questions that many of you have. So I wish I'd known this in the beginning of my career, right? The growth would have been so tremendous, but I caught up with the wave on time, and yeah, I've been able to scale up. So yeah, maybe on another episode I'm going to talk about my most recommended podcasts for voice talents, right, that you can listen to. And these podcasts, I can guarantee you, they will help you grow remarkably as long as you keep listening and you also practice some of the things that you're being told or you learn in this podcast. But a simple Google search will do, right? If you're really interested, you just Google search voiceover podcasts and you'll find a ton of them, and you can start listening, and that way you know which you really would love to, keep listening to. And by the way, don't stop listening to the Everything Voiceovers podcast African perspective because I'm sure you're learning a lot already. Another thing that I wrote here is funny, but that's just the truth. I wish that I had known that Fiverr and Upwork are not the only places I can find voiceover gigs. Yes, I wrote it here. For professional voiceover artists, of course they know this. But for people that are just starting out, a lot of them don't know that there are dedicated platforms for voiceover artists, for freelance voiceover artists. And these platforms, you either call them casting sites, some of them are pay-to-play sites, but they are platforms built for voiceover artists and also buyers of voiceovers, right? This was something I didn't know initially. And the truth is, if you do your research diligently, you're not going to fall victims to the lack of knowledge that I experienced in the beginning of my career. So it's really important to do your research. But the point here is that there are more platforms than you can imagine. If you don't know, there are more platforms than you can imagine that are dedicated to getting voiceover jobs for voice talents. And you see Upwork and Fiverr, these freelancing platforms, they're platforms that host general services, general freelancing skills. They're just not optimized for your voiceover experience. And that's why I've heard a lot of times that some professional voiceover artists would bash these platforms, or voice actors or voice talents that are using these platforms. Why? Because on those platforms, a lot of things go unchecked, especially with the prices or the charges. Imagine getting paid $5 for a proper commercial. It sounds very ridiculous, but that's the concept of Fiverr. Works that you can do for $5, as cheap as $5, right? And that's not really what we need in the voiceover industry, because as voiceover talent, we're trying to fend for ourselves. We're trying to look out for ourselves. We need to get properly paid by our clients. The last thing on our minds is having a platform that is selling voiceovers cheaply to clients. Now, I know that there are people listening to this and you're already registered on these platforms. I'm not saying you should stop using those platforms, but I would advise that you should learn more about, what you deserve to be paid. You should view rate cards. Like there's the GVAA rate card, there's the Gravy for the Brain rate card, and a couple of others like that. So when you have an idea of what you should be paid for the job that you're doing, you probably have a rethink. Now, it doesn't also mean that there are not clients that will pay you properly on those platforms. But the point is, the platforms were not optimized strictly for voiceovers. So, of course, you wouldn't expect that they will devote as much attention to the craft as a platform that is optimized strictly for voiceover artists, right? So you need to understand this, but then if you look at it also, there are pros and cons to this. The freelancer platforms like Upwork and Fiverr, they allow you to do works for free. They allow you to register for free and you get paid. But most of the other platforms that are designed specifically for voice talents, they require that you pay a certain fee, an annual subscription fee. Without paying this fee, you wouldn't have premium access to a lot of things. For instance, you may not be able to audition for jobs as much as you want. So there's a lot of limitation if you're not registering. And to be very honest, these prices in dollars converted to our own currency in Africa, depending on the part of Africa that you are, in some cases are very expensive. In some cases are not very expensive. Like I said, it depends on your currency and the value of your currency as compared to the dollar. But in any case, they're not cheap as well. So paying $500, for instance, for a year subscription is not cheap. So these are the things that you need to consider. But it's important for you to know that you're not limited to Fiverr and Upwork. There are lots of platforms that you can use. And on another episode, we can look at the different platforms that exist for voiceover artists, and we just talk about them. Again, a simple Google search will help you learn more. Anyway, let's go to the last point that I listed here for this episode, and it is that I wish that I knew that getting clients and auditioning is the real work. Recording is just the icing on the cake. I'll say that again. I wish that I knew that getting clients and auditioning is the real work. Recording is just the icing on the cake. How do I mean? So, as voiceover artists, of course, what people hear is what we do. That is like what is assumed to be the work. And that's not really wrong, because that's what we go to learn. That's what we're training about. I mean, that's why you go to a voiceover training school to learn and all of that. But that's part of the entire work. You can record all you want. If you're not getting the gigs, you're not making the money. And then with time, frustration is going to set in. If you've been listening to all of the things I've been saying, you'd realize that voiceover is not just an art. It's a business. So the business has to be sustained. And then you need to do a lot of business-related activities to ensure that you're able to get the gigs, right? So it's more like you'll be putting about 60% work to just business-related activities and maybe 30% to 40% work in the voiceover itself. So I don't know how best to explain this to you, but I think you already understand if you've been listening all through to what I've been saying. So I said, getting clients and auditioning, they are the real work. Because most of the times, in fact, it is a fact that you will audition more than you will ever do voiceover jobs, like real works for clients. Because as you're auditioning, there are hundreds of other voiceover talents that are auditioning for the same role, and one person is going to be selected. Or depending on the kind of project, a few persons will be selected. So you end up auditioning over and over again until you get selected for a gig. What that means is that the real work is in showing up every time there's a script to audition for and putting in your best effort. Okay, so I wouldn't even say it's an open secret. It's just the reality of things. We know in this industry that the real work is in auditioning. Like the voiceover you're trying to do is in the, because you need to make your audition as good as the real work itself, as good as the real voiceover itself, to up your chances of getting selected for that gig, of getting a callback. So the voiceover you hear out there, it's just like one in the many voiceover jobs, in the many voiceovers that the talents do almost on a daily basis to ensure that they get the job. What this means for people who are just starting, because, this is tailored towards things that I wish that I knew before I started my voiceover career, which is obviously tailored towards people that are just starting. What you need to understand is that it's beautiful to train your voice, but get mentally prepared that that voice is just a part of the work. Being a business person, auditioning, getting clients, negotiating, and a whole lot of other business-related activities, those are the real work. You need to work. You need to put in the effort. And don't be surprised, you're going to get a lot of no's before you get the yes. You're going to get a lot of, we're sorry. In fact, in most cases, you're not even going to get any response at all. So you need to be prepared mentally to keep auditioning and not giving up. And gradually, you get gigs. And if I'm going to tie this with the last point that I made, which is about the Upwork and Fiverr and pay-to-play sites and casting sites, I can also say that, of course, those platforms, you're going to see a lot of opportunities there. You'll audition for those opportunities. Like I've said, obviously you're not going to get called back from, some of them, if not many of them, especially when you're just starting. But it's also, I think it's wise, it's smart that after getting 1 or 2 jobs on those platforms, you can gather some money to subscribe, and that will increase your opportunity of getting access to more jobs that you can audition for, which also increases your opportunity of getting more jobs in itself and getting more money for yourself. So this is more like the trajectory of things, especially if you're banking on the internet source of jobs, because there are also direct source of jobs where somebody just reaches out to you directly, or you meet somebody one-on-one and stuff like that. The point again, in summary, is that voiceover is not just an art of using your voice, but it's a business. And I think this really summarizes all I've been saying so far. You need to treat it as such. And I think this is the biggest lesson for a lot of us. And for me particularly, I wish that I had known that this is as business can be, and I should have treated it that way. Yeah. So really, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the podcast. One more thing I think I should emphasize before the end of this episode is that to avoid making this kind of errors or lacking knowledge in this way that will affect your voiceover business, you need to do your research at the beginning. So you'll hear me say a simple Google search will help. If I had done my research properly at the beginning, I would most likely not find myself not knowing these things. So I'm going to say 2 things about the research thing I just talked about. One is that it is your responsibility as a voiceover artist to do your diligent research and figure out how to create a sustainable business for yourself. After understanding that it's not just about your voice, but it's a source of income, it's a business. So that responsibility is on you. The other part of this is that I feel like, and I stand to be corrected, but there is a responsibility on people who are established in the industry. Now, arguably, not for everybody, because not everybody is going to take on that responsibility, which is fine. But then, it's unfortunate that we don't have enough sources of information about voiceovers tailored for the African voice talent. So, I would say that it's important for people who have been established or who are established in the voiceover business in Africa, and they have a means of creating platforms where people can learn more about these things. I would say that it's important for them to, do that. Again, it's not a must, but if you have the capacity to do so, you can do so. Let me give you an example of what I'm saying. I don't know, I'm not sure there are many books that have been written about voiceovers by Africans, right? I know the legendary Chilulemba has a book about voiceover. I know the amazing Sheun Shobo has a book about voiceovers. I don't know so much about other people in the continent. Now, I'm not saying that people should go out to become authors, all of a sudden, but I'm saying that we should be intentional about documenting or creating platforms and avenues where people can learn about the craft. If you can, as simple as creating a blog that you can, put something out about voiceovers, or even tweeting about voiceovers, I think that would really go a very long way. I know Jamaldeen does a lot of that, and a couple of other people that I know in the industry, they do a lot of that, and I want to commend everybody. I really want to do so. There are voiceover training academies and institutions in Africa that are growing by the day, trying to put out as much information and resources for voice talent. So kudos to everybody doing this, and I'm excited. We're all trying to build the industry together, and I believe that knowledge is the number one way to build an industry, because when people know what to do, they begin to do what they need to do. For people who are just learning, you need to do your research. And for people who are established and they have a lot of knowledge, they need to create avenues where people can learn from them. If you want to monetize yours, it's fine. And if you want to, be helpful, be generous with your knowledge, or if you want to share tips and stuff like that, it's fine. But we need to ensure that there are enough right information in the system and that people can have access to. So thank you all for listening finally to this amazing episode of the Everything Voiceovers podcast, the African Perspective. Yes, it's my pleasure to always bring this to you every week. So I look forward to the next episode of the podcast. But one thing I look forward to, equally important, is I look forward to your feedback. Send me your feedback. You can send me directly on Instagram. You can send it to @everythingviews on Instagram. And it will be our pleasure to read your feedback, your opinion, what you have to say about the episode you just listened to. Or if you have advice, if you have suggestions, we're happy to listen, to read actually. And you can send them formally to our email at everythingvoiceovers@gmail.com. everythingvoiceovers@gmail.com. And tell somebody about this podcast. Subscribe to the podcast on any platform that you listen to the podcast so you can get notified every time we have a new episode. And of course, we can keep learning together. Thank you all once again for listening to this episode, and I'll see you in the next episode. Till then, keep learning, keep researching, and keep voicing. Bye for now.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell someone about it. Follow the podcast on Everything Videos on all social media platforms. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode. This podcast is a Coded Voiceovers production.